Hello students. This class is for the class of Social Studies, and I'm going to present a few topics that is gonna serve as reference for you to study. First, I'm going to present the slideshows that I've already explained on the previous class. These slideshows have to do with decolonization. This is the first of the slideshows, and this is something that we already reviewed. This is the slideshows that I'm going to give you, that I'm going to pass to you via Edukai. Okay, so the last class we've only reached up to the class activity, and we talked about the decolonization. Okay, in this class we're going to continue that topic and talk about the social movements, and previously talked about the technology and advances. Now let's start with the social movements. Now the social movements is when a group of people reunite and they have with the objective, with a common goal, that is to resist. It could be resist government, it could be resist laws, could resist society, resist some sort of resistance. And on the other hand, social movements could also form by groups of people who want to accomplish something. They have the same goal in mind. So when these groups of people have common grounds, that is to resist or to achieve something, then they are going to unite and form social movements. And this is the topic of today. Now, the social movements, generally arose when there is abuse and inequity. So when people are uncomfortable with with the normal standards of society, then they're gonna want to seek change, and they want to seek change, and they find out that it's hard to seek change when they're individuals. So that's when they form groups and unite themselves with other people that form or that have the same interest. And when they have the same interest, then their voice can be projected. In other words, they have more power. As a group, they have more power and more influence as they are as individuals. So in this slide shot, we can see that we can see a few examples of social movements that arose on different times. The first interesting topic that I want to talk about is the youth movement. Now, youth, it refers to young people. Okay. Now, throughout the history, throughout hundreds of years, young people were not generally the protagonist of the developments of history. It was always the powerful people that are generally the ones in command and the ones who were the leaders, but they were not young. Generally, they were very old people. That's why we understand that old people, we refer to them as a synonym of wisdom, for example. Now, young people were just considered throughout history powerless. Now, what's interesting is that in the year 1960s, during the 1960s, the young people started to be the protagonists of history. And by protagonists of history, I mean that they were the ones who were in charge of doing things that were directed toward change. So for the first time in history, the notion of the young people being the protagonist of history and the ones leading to the future and leading to change was starting to take grounds. So during this time, the 1960s, in the Western world, young people became unprecedentedly active. And they started to create groups. They started to form groups with their same interest. And as I said before, this interest could be in order to resist something or in order to accomplish something. Now, the first example that I'm going to talk about is the one here in France. Now, the peculiar thing is that in France and Mexico, they both experienced social movement in the same year, in 1968. But the difference is that on the side of France, the students were the protagonists of this social movement, and what they were seeking was university reforms. Okay, so two elements important in this. And when we talk about the social movement of France, the first is that the protagonists were the students, And on the other side, what they wanted to accomplish was university reforms. On Mexico, on the other hand, not only were students the one who were the protagonists of this social movement, but also teachers, housewives, and in general the citizens were the ones who participated in this social movement. And what they wanted to resist was a government, the government of Diaz Ordaz. Um, there was a lot of casualties in this social movement because there was a lot of violence involved and many people died. On the contrary, in France there was not so much casualty, so that is something that you have to take into consideration. In Mexico there was a lot more casualties. In other words, there was a lot more people injured and a lot of people died. Not so much in France. Now, the next social movement is the hippies. The hippies, they live by the words of love and peace. They were formed in California. Remember this day. They were born in California. They arose in California in 1966. But the special thing about the hippies is that the people who formed part of this social movement adopted fashion and some customs, right? While social movements generally don't go to such extremes. So the interesting thing about the hippies is that not only did they share common interest, but this reflected this interest, or this like culture of this social movement reflected on their fashion and customs. So that is something that doesn't really happen often, but it's something that the hippies accomplished. And music, for example, was another thing that they shared in common, and this type of lifestyle is something that they reflected. On the other hand, social movements, for example, in France and Mexico, they did not adopt fashion or customs. They just shared interest and realized actions in order to obtain or accomplish these goals or achieve what they sought to. Okay. Now the next is the feminist movement. Now this movement, well, consisted of women who fought for political rights and equal treatment in working conditions. Okay, so this social movement in particular was not comfortable with their position in society. They sought to achieve more, and in that process they accomplish these goals. Remember that a social movement could also be formed to accomplish something, which is the case of the feminist movement. They accomplished better positioning in society. They were no longer at the margin of society. They now share the same position in terms of rights, in terms of power. That is something they didn't have previously before forming the social movement. Now the next social movement is one that seems to be the most relevant social movement in the U.S. between the 1950s and the 1960s. This social movement had a very famous leader, which is Martin Luther King Jr. Now this person fought a non-violent battle to gain recognition of the civil rights of African Americans. Okay, so the difference is that in this social movement he did not fight with violence. He fought a non-violent battle, and he accomplished many things. He is one of the most referenced leaders regarding the social movement, and especially in the United States between the 1950s and the 1960s. He has Afro descendants, and the people who were part of this social movement were generally Afro descendants, but further on they regained the backup or the help of, well, other like political parties and other actors of society. And the next we're going to talk about is the indigenous movement in Latin America. Now this movement took place in various countries of Latin America. For example, in Mexico, apart from the social movement that I've mentioned previously, there was also another social movement that fought for agrarian issues. And by agrarian, I mean that I refer to the plantations and the haciendas and the laws that imply growing and farming. That is what I mean by agrarian issues. And this movement also had a leader that was Emiliano Zapata. Okay, next in 2006, 11 Andean Indigenous Association funded were organized themselves and created a social movement called Coordinadora Andina de Organizaciones Indígenas. Now, this is another example of social movement in Latin America. Now, continuing, we have, for example, that in Brazil there was also a social movement where people gathered in the year 2019 at the Global Social Forum. Now, this forum treated topics regarding issues of environment, political, government, etc. But the thing is that this was a space where people with the same interest reunited and accumulated power and influence and sought to change something. That was why this is relevant, and this took place in Brazil. Next is for example, in Ecuador and Bolivia, we accomplished things through social movements that fought for environment and fought for conserving nature. And what we achieved was that our constitution includes a part which says that we have inclusion of culture and language diversity. So this is something that we achieved by social movements. In other words, by exercising power through the voices of many people who have the same interests. Okay, now that is the social movements. Next topic is the scientific advances and cultural changes. Now remember that during World War I and World War II, there was a lot of scientific advantages, scientific developments, and this was mainly due because, well, there exists a competition that we're going to talk about right now, and there was a type of race, there was a sort of race that was going on worldwide to see who had the best who had the best scientists, who can perform the best military, who can display the best military power. And because, in other words, having the best technology could mean having more power. But this power could also be, well, sorry, not power, but this technology could also be beneficial for the citizens of the countries who had more scientific developments. And in the 20th century, this scientific development changed the way people lived. And this century, which may have seen more technological and scientific progress than all of the other centuries combined since the dawn of civilization. That is correct, because previously, well, hundreds of years ago, a single technological innovation or technological development will take years and years to develop and to finally be significant enough to impact the lives of the citizens of the world in that time. But during this time, the 20th century, the development was so fast and so significant that it changed the lives of the people who could lucky enough to witness it. Now, as I said before, why was there scientific advances? Now, basically during this time there was two major superpowers in the world. There was think of it as two teams. The first team is capitalism and the other is communism. Now, if you recall the Cold War, these were the two blocks that fought each other. But they didn't fight on battlefields with weapons and tanks and soldiers. The new battlefields in which the Cold War took place was the race to the moon, was the Olympics, was cinema, because these were spaces where the countries could demonstrate that they were superior to the other bloc, that capitalism was superior to communism or communism was superior to capitalism. They wanted to demonstrate their power, so the new battlefields or the new spaces where they demonstrated this conflict between them was no longer on a space where soldiers died. It was more complex than that. It was in the cinema, the race to the moon, arms race, the Olympics, for example. And on the side of the capitalism was the United States, and on the side of communism was the Soviet Union. These were the two major superpowers who participated in the Cold War. They were the protagonists of the Cold War. Now, what happened on the side of the United States of America? Well, after the war, many benefits reached the United States. This was a very good time for them. This was when they enjoyed wealth and prosperity and most of all power, because they could demonstrate to the world their power, and they were recognized as a significant superpower worldwide. And the influence of this country extended far from home. It reached the whole world. The position that they achieved was enormous. Their currency, which is the dollar, reached international standards. So financially, they kept growing, and they developed not only technology but food, clothing, movies, machines, and science. Made the American name known throughout the world. They developed the cinema industry, and they became well-grounded commercially, and their products reach worldwide. Now, a lot of products came to light during the second half of the 20th century. For example, the most important or the most influential is the internet. The internet is a form of was first used with the purpose of providing military support, but then it expanded to the society, and it nowadays has all sorts of applications and benefits that it can provide. The transportation, while previously, years ago, before the development of, for example, vehicles, cards, letters were transported by primitive means, and it was very inefficient. So the increase or the improvement of communication was a major factor to the development society. But radio and telephone were also on great demand, as well as the development of the cell phone and in future the airplane. So these were the technological innovations that occurred, started at the beginning of the first half of the 20th century and took force at the second half of the 20th century. Remember that basically these technological innovations were product of the competition of the two blocks. They wanted to see who could produce the best and more innovation, who can produce the best technology, which country could develop and incorporate it usefully into their citizens and into their military operations. So the technology was a major factor in the lives of people who lived throughout this era. And that is the feedback regarding these two topics. Well, thank you guys. This slide chart is what I'm going to upload to you guys, so you guys have access to this. If you missed a subject or two, if you have any questions, you can feel free to communicate me and ask. And thank you for listening.